Buffalo Bill and Sitting Bull, the showman who sold his enemy's story. That title alone sounds like something Hollywood would reject for being too dramatic, too unlikely, too strange to be real. And yet, every word of it is true. In the late 1800s, two men stood on opposite sides of American history. One was a frontiersman turned celebrity, a man who transformed the Wild West into a traveling spectacle watched by millions. The other was a Lakota leader, a spiritual figure, a man who had witnessed the defeat of one of America's most famous military commanders. They should have been enemies. They should have never shared a stage. But somehow, against all logic and expectation, they did. This is not a story about heroes and villains. It is a story about survival, spectacle, and the strange alliances that history sometimes creates. It is about how one man turned conflict into entertainment, and how another man chose to participate in his own mythology. It is about America itself, a nation so fascinated by its own past that it would pay to watch it reenacted, night after night, in arenas packed with thousands of cheering spectators. And at the center of it all were two men who understood something most people never figure out. Sometimes the best way to control your story is to be the one telling it. William Frederick Cody was born in 1846 in the Iowa Territory. His father was a farmer, a man who believed in hard work and open land. The family moved to Kansas when William was still a boy, and it was there, on the edge of the frontier, that he first encountered the world that would define him. Kansas in the 1850s was not a peaceful place. It was a territory torn apart by competing visions of what America should become. Tensions ran high, neighbors distrusted neighbors, and young William, barely into his teenage years, found himself thrust into situations that most children could never imagine. His father passed away when William was just 11 years old. Suddenly, the boy was the primary provider for his family. There was no time for childhood games, no time for school. There was only work, hard, relentless, dangerous work. He took jobs wherever he could find them. He worked as a messenger, riding horses across vast distances to deliver communications. He worked as a herder, driving cattle and oxen across the prairie. He learned to ride before most children learned to read. He learned to navigate terrain that had no roads, no signs, no markers of any kind. By the time he was 15, William Cody had already lived more than most men experience in a lifetime. He had crossed the plains multiple times. He had faced harsh weather, hostile encounters, and the constant uncertainty of frontier life, and he had developed a skill that would serve him well for the rest of his days. He knew how to survive. But survival was just the beginning. What William Cody really wanted was something bigger, something that would lift him out of the anonymous struggle of frontier existence. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to be remembered. He wanted to be someone. The opportunity came in the form of the Pony Express. In 1860, a new mail delivery service was established, promising to carry messages from Missouri to California in just 10 days. It was an audacious undertaking, requiring riders who could push themselves and their horses to the absolute limit. The pay was good, the danger was extreme, and William Cody, at just 14 years old, signed up immediately. The Pony Express would only last 18 months before the telegraph made it obsolete. But during that brief window, William Cody built a reputation. He was fast. He was reliable. He could ride longer distances than almost anyone else. On one legendary occasion, at least according to the stories he would later tell, he completed a continuous ride of over 300 miles, changing horses at each station, but never stopping to rest himself. Was the story true? Maybe, maybe not. The frontier was a place where facts and legends blurred together, where a man's reputation often outpaced his actual accomplishments. What mattered was that people believed it, and William Cody understood. Even then, that belief was more powerful than reality. When the Civil War erupted, Cody joined the Union forces. He served as a scout, using his knowledge of the terrain to guide military units through unfamiliar territory. He was good at it. He was very good at it. But the war itself was a brutal experience, one that left scars both visible and invisible on everyone who participated. After the war ended, Cody found himself at a crossroads. The frontier was changing. The open land that had once seemed limitless was being carved up, settled, transformed. The railroads were pushing west, bringing civilization to places that had never seen it. And with the railroads came a new industry, buffalo hunting. The railroads needed to feed their workers. Thousands of men were laying track across the plains, and they needed meat. Buffalo were plentiful, easy to find, and provided enormous quantities of food. Companies hired hunters to supply the railroad camps, and William Cody was one of the best. Over an 18-month period, Cody claimed to have taken down over 4,000 buffalo. The number is staggering. It is also, in retrospect, deeply troubling. The great buffalo herds that had sustained Native American communities for generations were being systematically eliminated. What seemed like an economic opportunity was actually an ecological catastrophe, one that would have devastating consequences for indigenous peoples across the Great Plains. But at the time, William Cody saw only opportunity, and he gained a nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life, Buffalo Bill. The name stuck because it captured something essential about who Cody was becoming. He was no longer just another frontier scout, another anonymous hunter on the plains. He was Buffalo Bill, a character, a legend, a brand. And he was only getting started. In 1869, a writer named Ned Buntline traveled west looking for material. Buntline wrote dime novels, cheap paperback adventures that sold for a few cents and were devoured by readers hungry for tales of frontier excitement. He was looking for a hero, someone whose exploits could be dramatized and sold to the masses. He found William Cody. Buntline wrote a novel called Buffalo Bill, the King of Bordermen. It was published in a popular magazine and became an immediate sensation. Readers could not get enough of this fearless frontiersman, this crack shot, this hero of the plains. They did not care whether the stories were accurate. They cared that they were exciting. Suddenly, William Cody was famous, not for anything he had actually done, but for what a writer had imagined he might have done. And Cody, ever the opportunist, recognized the potential immediately. If people wanted to see Buffalo Bill, then Buffalo Bill would give them a show. In 1872, Cody made his theatrical debut in a stage production written by Buntline himself. The play was crude, the acting was amateurish, and the plot made little sense. Critics dismissed it as nonsense, but audiences loved it. They packed theaters to see the real Buffalo Bill, in the flesh, reenacting adventures that may or may not have actually happened. Cody discovered something that would shape the rest of his career. Americans were hungry for the West. They wanted to experience the frontier, but from the safety of a theater seat. They wanted danger without risk, adventure without consequence, and Cody was perfectly positioned to give it to them. For the next decade, he performed in theaters across the country, building his reputation and his fortune. But he was not satisfied. The stage was too small, too limiting. He wanted something bigger, something that would capture the full scope and spectacle of the frontier he had known. In 1883, he created it, Buffalo Bill's Wild West. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Because stories like this, stories that reveal the hidden truths behind the legends we think we know, are exactly what we explore here every single week. If you want to see what history books leave out, hit that subscribe button right now. Chapter 2. Buffalo Bill's Wild West was not a circus. Cody was always very clear about that distinction. Circuses had clowns and acrobats and trained animals. His show was something different. It was a recreation, a living history, a chance to witness in person the drama and excitement of the American frontier. The show debuted in Omaha, Nebraska, in the summer of 1883. From the very first performance, it was clear that Cody had created something unprecedented. The arena was massive, designed to accommodate hundreds of horses, dozens of performers, and audiences of thousands. The scale was breathtaking. The program included a variety of acts, each designed to showcase a different aspect of frontier life. There were demonstrations of sharpshooting, with marksmen hitting targets that seemed impossibly distant. There were displays of horsemanship, with riders performing stunts that defied belief. There were reenactments of historical events, dramatized for maximum excitement. And there were Native American performers. This was the element that made Buffalo Bill's Wild West truly unique. Cody recruited actual indigenous people to participate in his show, portraying themselves in scripted scenarios that depicted conflicts between settlers and tribes. The performers were paid. They were fed. They were, in many ways, treated better than they would have been on the reservations where the government had confined them. But they were also participating in something deeply problematic. The show presented a version of history that was, at best, simplified. At worst, it was a celebration of conquest, a triumphal narrative that cast Native Americans as obstacles to be overcome, rather than as peoples with their own complex histories and perspectives. Cody himself had complicated views on indigenous peoples. He had fought against them during his years as a scout. He had participated in conflicts that resulted in deaths on both sides, but he also expressed respect for their skills, their courage, their knowledge of the land. He hired them as performers because he believed they were essential to the authenticity of his show. And he paid them, which was more than the government typically did. The show traveled constantly. It crossed the country by train, performing in cities large and small. It toured Europe, playing before royalty and common folk alike. Queen Victoria herself attended a performance in London and reportedly enjoyed it immensely. The Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII, was a fan. By the mid-1880s, Buffalo Bill's Wild West was the most popular entertainment in America. Millions of people had seen it. Millions more had read about it in newspapers and magazines. William Cody had transformed himself from a frontier scout into a global celebrity, a brand name recognized around the world. And then he did something that shocked everyone. He hired Sitting Bull. To understand why this was so remarkable, you need to understand who Sitting Bull was. He was not just another chief. He was not just another leader. He was the man most associated in the American public mind with the greatest military defeat the United States had ever suffered at the hands of indigenous forces. In 1876, at a place called the Little Bighorn River in Montana Territory, a combined force of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors had destroyed a column of the 7th Cavalry under the command of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. Every single soldier under Custer's immediate command was lost. It was a stunning victory for the tribes and a devastating humiliation for the United States military. Sitting Bull had not personally led the warriors in that engagement. He was a spiritual leader, a holy man whose role was to provide guidance and vision rather than tactical command. But he was present. He had prophesied the victory, and in the aftermath he became the symbol of indigenous resistance, the face that Americans associated with their most painful military memory. For years after Little Bighorn, Sitting Bull remained beyond the reach of American authorities. He led his followers into Canada, where he lived in exile, refusing to surrender to a government he did not recognize. But life in Canada was hard. The buffalo were gone. His people were hungry. And eventually, reluctantly, he returned to the United States and surrendered. He was held as a prisoner for 2 years. Then he was released and sent to the Standing Rock Reservation in Dakota Territory, where he was expected to live quietly, forgotten by history. But Sitting Bull was not a man who could be forgotten. He remained a powerful figure, a leader whose words carried weight even in captivity. The government watched him carefully, suspicious of his influence, worried that he might spark renewed resistance. And the American public remained fascinated by him, this mysterious figure who had humbled their army and then walked away. It was into this charged atmosphere that Buffalo Bill Cody made his audacious proposal. He wanted Sitting Bull to join his show. The idea seemed insane. Sitting Bull was associated with the greatest defeat in American military history. He was a symbol of everything the Wild West show supposedly celebrated the conquest of. Why would he agree to participate? And why would Cody want him? The answers reveal something profound about both men. For Cody, the calculus was simple. Sitting Bull was famous, notoriously famous, the kind of famous that made people pay money just to catch a glimpse. Having him in the show would be a sensation, a publicity coup that no competitor could match. It would also add a veneer of authenticity that even the most elaborate reenactments could not achieve. This was not an actor playing a chief. This was the chief himself. For Sitting Bull, the calculation was more complex. He was a prisoner in all but name. His people were confined to reservations, dependent on government rations that were often inadequate or late. The old ways were disappearing. The buffalo were gone. The freedom his people had once known existed only in memory. Joining the show offered something unexpected. Agency. Sitting Bull would be paid for his appearances. He would travel. He would see the cities of the white men, understand their world better, and he would have a platform, however strange, to be seen and heard. There was also something else, something that would become apparent only later, as their partnership unfolded. Sitting Bull and Buffalo Bill, despite everything that should have divided them, developed something that looked remarkably like friendship. Chapter 3. Sitting Bull joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West in June of 1885. He was 54 years old. The arrangement was negotiated carefully. Sitting Bull would receive $50 a week, a substantial sum at the time. He would also receive a signing bonus of $125, sole rights to sell photographs and autographs of himself, and 2 weeks of paid travel before the season began. In addition, Cody agreed to hire several other Lakota performers, ensuring that Sitting Bull would not be isolated among strangers. The terms were generous, more generous than anything the government had ever offered, and Sitting Bull accepted. His role in the show was carefully designed. He did not participate in the battle reenactments. He did not pretend to charge at settlers or attack stagecoaches. Instead, his part was simpler, almost ceremonial. He would ride into the arena alone, and the announcer would introduce him. That was it. That was his entire act. He would appear, be introduced, and the audience would react. And react they did, but not in the way you might expect. There was booing, there was hissing, there were insults shouted from the stands. Many Americans had not forgotten Little Bighorn. They had not forgiven. To them, Sitting Bull was the enemy, the man responsible for the deaths of Custer and his soldiers. They came to the show specifically to express their hatred. Sitting Bull took it all without visible reaction. He sat on his horse, impassive, dignified, watching the crowds that watched him. If he felt anger or humiliation, he did not show it. He simply waited until his moment in the arena was over, then rode out the way he had come. But here is the remarkable thing. His stoic dignity began to change minds. Night after night, audience members who came to jeer found themselves unable to sustain their hostility. There was something in his bearing, his presence, that commanded respect despite everything. He was not performing defeat. He was performing endurance. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the boos began to mix with applause. Cody was shrewd enough to recognize what was happening. He began introducing Sitting Bull differently, emphasizing his role as a leader, a man of principle, someone who had fought for his people with courage and conviction. The narrative shifted. Sitting Bull was no longer presented as a villain to be despised, but as a worthy opponent to be respected. It was a subtle change, but it mattered. Behind the scenes, the relationship between Cody and Sitting Bull deepened. They spent time together when the show was not performing. They talked, through interpreters, about their lives, their experiences, their views of the world. They discovered that they had more in common than either had expected. Both men were performers in their way. Both understood the power of spectacle and myth. Both had created versions of themselves that were larger than life, personas that the public consumed eagerly. And both were struggling to maintain their identity in a world that was rapidly changing. Sitting Bull was particularly struck by what he saw as he traveled with the show. He visited cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. He saw the vast populations, the towering buildings, the endless streams of people rushing through streets that never seemed to sleep. He saw poverty, too, homeless children begging on corners, families living in squalor despite the wealth that surrounded them. This troubled him deeply. In Lakota culture, generosity was a fundamental value. Wealth was meant to be shared, not hoarded. A leader who allowed his people to go hungry while he lived in comfort was no leader at all. Yet here, in the heart of American civilization, he saw exactly that. Abundance and deprivation existing side by side, apparently without shame. Sitting Bull began giving away his money. He gave it to the homeless children he encountered. He gave it to street performers. He gave it to anyone who seemed to need it more than he did. By the end of each tour stop, he often had nothing left of his earnings. Cody found this baffling but endearing. He had never met anyone quite like Sitting Bull, a man who seemed genuinely uninterested in accumulating wealth for its own sake. They were opposites in many ways. Cody the showman, always seeking the spotlight, and Sitting Bull the mystic, finding meaning in quieter places, but somehow they understood each other. There is a famous photograph from this period. It shows Cody and Sitting Bull standing together, both in elaborate costume, both looking directly at the camera. Cody is smiling, confident, comfortable. Sitting Bull's expression is harder to read. There is dignity there, certainly, perhaps a hint of amusement, but also something else, a wariness maybe, or a sadness that no pose could fully conceal. If this moment moved you, if you felt something watching these two former enemies stand together, trapped in their own legend, then leave a comment right now saying, "History never tells the whole truth." I want to know who else feels the weight of stories like this. The partnership lasted only 4 months. At the end of the 1885 season, Sitting Bull chose not to return. The reasons were never fully explained. Perhaps he was tired of the constant travel, the noise, the endless crowds. Perhaps he missed his home, his family, the familiar landscape of Standing Rock. Perhaps he had seen enough of the white man's world and had no desire to see more. Or perhaps he had simply accomplished what he set out to do. He had been seen. He had been heard. He had walked among the conquerors and shown them that he could not be diminished by their gaze. Cody tried to convince him to return. He offered more money, better terms, anything that might change his mind. But Sitting Bull was firm. One season was enough. He was going home. They parted as something closer to friends than either would have predicted. Cody gave Sitting Bull gifts, a performing horse, a broad white hat, tokens of an unlikely bond. And Sitting Bull returned to the reservation, carrying with him memories of strange cities and stranger experiences. Chapter 4. Life at Standing Rock was difficult. The reservation system was designed to break indigenous identity, to force assimilation into white American culture. Traditional practices were forbidden. Children were sent to boarding schools where they were punished for speaking their own languages. The proud nations of the Great Plains were being systematically dismantled. Sitting Bull resisted. He continued to speak out against policies he found unjust. He encouraged his people to maintain their traditions, even when it was dangerous to do so. He became once again a source of concern for government authorities who had never stopped watching him. In the late 1880s, a new movement swept across the reservations. It was called the Ghost Dance, a spiritual practice that promised the restoration of the old ways. Through specific rituals and ceremonies, practitioners believed the buffalo would return, the ancestors would rise, and the white invaders would disappear. It was a movement born of desperation, a last hope for peoples who had been stripped of everything else. The government viewed the ghost dance as a threat. They did not understand it, did not want to understand it. They saw only the potential for uprising, for renewed conflict, and they blamed Sitting Bull. In truth, Sitting Bull's relationship with the ghost dance movement was complicated. He did not fully embrace its teachings, but he did not condemn them either. He saw in it the longing of his people for a world that had been taken from them. He could not bring himself to crush that hope, even if he doubted the promise. But nuance was lost on authorities who saw only danger. In December of 1890, they decided to act. Indian police were sent to Sitting Bull's cabin in the early morning hours. Their orders were to arrest him, to remove him from the reservation before he could cause trouble. What happened next would become one of the most tragic events in the long, sad history of American treatment of indigenous peoples. There was a confrontation. Tensions escalated, shots were fired. When the chaos finally subsided, Sitting Bull lay on the ground, his life ended by the bullets of his own people, men who had been recruited by the government to police their brothers. He was 59 years old. The news spread quickly. Within days, it had reached newspapers across the country. William Cody, by then one of the most famous men in America, learned of his former partner's fate. By most accounts, Cody was devastated. He had tried, in fact, to prevent exactly this outcome. When he learned that authorities were planning to arrest Sitting Bull, he had offered to go himself, to use his relationship with the chief to bring him in peacefully. The request was approved, then withdrawn at the last moment. Cody arrived too late to change anything. He attended to what he could. He made arrangements for Sitting Bull's family. He purchased the performing horse he had given to Sitting Bull years earlier, the one that had been trained to sit and raise its hoof at the sound of gunfire. According to legend, the horse performed its tricks during the fatal confrontation, confused by the sounds it had been trained to respond to. Whether that story is true or not, it captures something essential about the tragedy. Even at the end, Sitting Bull was surrounded by reminders of the strange world he had briefly inhabited, a world of performance and spectacle that had offered him a platform but could never offer him justice. Chapter 5. Buffalo Bill's Wild West continued for years after Sitting Bull's passing. It remained one of the most popular entertainments in the world, touring America and Europe to enormous crowds. But something had changed. Cody himself seemed aware of it. In interviews and public statements, he spoke of Sitting Bull with respect and regret. He never suggested that the chief had been an enemy who deserved his fate. Instead, he portrayed him as a friend, a man of honor, someone who had been treated poorly by a government that did not understand him. This was a remarkable position for a man who had built his career on celebrating the conquest of the West. It suggested that Cody, for all his showmanship, had learned something from his brief partnership with Sitting Bull. He had seen the world, perhaps, through different eyes. The show itself began to evolve. New acts were added, new performers recruited, but the core remained the same, a recreation of a frontier that was rapidly disappearing, a celebration of an era that existed increasingly in memory rather than reality. By the early 1900s, the Wild West was in decline. The novelty had worn off. New forms of entertainment were capturing public attention, movies in particular, which could recreate frontier drama more cheaply and more spectacularly than any live show. Cody's finances suffered. He made poor investments, trusted unscrupulous partners, and watched his fortune slowly evaporate. He tried various schemes to recover. He merged his show with other companies. He appeared in early films. He even participated in an actual military campaign, the Hunt for Pancho Villa in 1916, though by then he was in his 70s and in poor health. William Frederick Cody passed away in January of 1917. He was 70 years old. He died with almost nothing, the vast fortune he had once accumulated, long gone. But his fame endured. He was buried on Lookout Mountain near Denver, Colorado, and his grave became a tourist attraction, drawing visitors who wanted to pay their respects to the man who had defined, for better or worse, how the world imagined the American West. Chapter 6. So what are we to make of this story? What lessons can we draw from the unlikely partnership between a showman and a chief, an entertainer and a mystic, a man who sold myths and a man who became one? Perhaps the most important lesson is about the nature of history itself. The past is not a fixed thing, a set of facts waiting to be discovered. It is a story we tell ourselves, shaped by the people who have the power to tell it. William Cody understood this intuitively. He built an empire on the human hunger for narrative, for drama, for tales of courage and adventure. But Sitting Bull understood something equally important. Sometimes the best way to control your story is to participate in its telling. By joining the Wild West show, he did not surrender his identity. He claimed it. He showed himself to millions of people who might otherwise have known him only through hostile newspaper accounts. He refused to be invisible. There is a tension here that has never been fully resolved. Cody's show, for all its spectacular appeal, presented a version of history that was deeply problematic. It celebrated conquest. It simplified cultures. It turned tragedy into entertainment. And yet it also provided a platform, and a strange, compromised, imperfect platform for indigenous people to be seen and heard. Sitting Bull took what was offered and made something of it. He earned money that he gave to the poor. He witnessed the cities of his conquerors and formed his own judgments about what he saw. He maintained his dignity in circumstances designed to strip it away. And he formed an unlikely bond with a man who should have been his enemy but somehow was not. Their friendship, if that is the right word, suggests that human connection can transcend the categories we create to divide ourselves. Showman and chief, soldier and mystic, conqueror and conquered, they found something in each other that mattered more than the roles history had assigned them. This is not a simple story. It is not a story with easy heroes and villains. It is a story about compromise and survival, about the strange alliances that emerge when worlds collide. It is a story about America itself, a nation that has always been fascinated by its own mythology, even when that mythology obscures more than it reveals. Buffalo Bill and Sitting Bull are both gone now, more than a century dead. But the questions their partnership raised remain alive. How do we tell stories about the past? Whose voices are included and whose are silenced? What do we lose when we simplify complexity into spectacle? These are not just historical questions. They are questions we face every day, in how we consume media, how we understand events, how we make sense of the world around us. The next time you encounter a story that seems too neat, too simple, too clearly divided into good and evil, remember these two men. Remember the showman who sold myths and the chief who refused to disappear. Remember that history is always more complicated than it appears. And remember that sometimes the most powerful act of resistance is simply to be seen. If you watched this far, it is because you felt something. It is because this story mattered to you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far," so I can get to know you and know who really likes the stories on this channel. Your presence here means everything. And if this story moved you, if it made you think or feel or question something you thought you knew, then do me a favor. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have not already, subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story like this one. Because this is just the beginning. There are so many more untold stories waiting to be discovered, so many more hidden truths buried beneath the legends we think we know, and I want you here for all of them. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about history. Not the simple version, but the real version, the complicated, messy, human version. Until next time. The frontier was a stage, and everyone played their part. Some roles were chosen, others were imposed. But in the end, what mattered was not the costume or the script. What mattered was who we became when the lights went down. Buffalo Bill understood performance. Sitting Bull understood presence. Together they created something that neither could have achieved alone. A moment in time when former enemies stood side by side, each using the other for purposes the audience could only guess at. Was it exploitation? Was it alliance? Was it friendship? Perhaps it was all three tangled together in ways that cannot be neatly separated. The Wild West show traveled across continents, bringing its version of America to audiences who had never seen the real thing. They watched cowboys and Indians chase each other across dusty arenas. They cheered at sharpshooting demonstrations. They gasped at stagecoach attacks and buffalo hunts. They believed they were seeing history. But history is never so simple. The Indians in the show were real people with real lives, performing roles that reduced their cultures to spectacle. The cowboys were often professional performers who had never actually worked cattle. The battles were choreographed routines, repeated night after night until the performers knew every step by heart. And yet, something true emerged from all that artifice. Sitting Bull, sitting alone on his horse while crowds booed and cheered, was not playing a role. He was simply being himself, a man who had lived through extraordinary experiences and refused to be reduced by them. There is power in that kind of presence. It cannot be faked. It cannot be manufactured by even the most skilled showman. It comes from somewhere deeper, from a life fully lived and a self fully inhabited. Cody recognized it. That is why he wanted Sitting Bull in his show, not just for the publicity, though that certainly mattered, but because Sitting Bull brought something that money could not buy: authenticity. In a show built on illusion, he was undeniably real. The tour season of 1885 took them across the northeastern United States and into Canada. They performed in Boston, where crowds gathered to see the man who had humbled Custer. They performed in Philadelphia, where Sitting Bull walked the streets and observed a world utterly unlike anything he had known. He saw factories where workers labored in conditions that shocked him. He saw mansions where the wealthy lived in luxury beyond imagining. He saw homeless children huddled in doorways while well-dressed pedestrians walked past without looking. He saw a society that had conquered his people and claimed to be civilized. His judgment was quiet but clear. This was not civilization. This was something else, a system that allowed some to prosper while others suffered, that valued accumulation over generosity, that measured success in dollars rather than dignity. He gave away everything he earned. He could not keep it. It felt wrong to hoard wealth while others had nothing. Every coin that passed through his hands ended up in the hands of someone who needed it more. Cody found this baffling and admirable in equal measure. He himself was constantly chasing money, constantly scheming for new ways to increase his fortune. He could not imagine voluntarily surrendering wealth, but he respected Sitting Bull's consistency, his refusal to compromise his values even when surrounded by temptation. Their conversations, filtered through interpreters, ranged across many subjects. They talked about the old days when the frontier was still wild and both men were young. They talked about the future, which neither could predict, but both knew would be different from the past. They talked about their families, their hopes, their regrets. Cody spoke of his son who had died in childhood, and a loss that still haunted him decades later. Sitting Bull spoke of his own children, some of whom had died young, others who lived but faced an uncertain future in a conquered land. They shared the universal grief of parents who have outlived their offspring, a sorrow that transcends all boundaries of culture and history. In those quiet moments, away from the crowds and the spectacle, they were simply two men trying to make sense of lives that had taken unexpected turns. The labels that the world had assigned them, hero and villain, showman and chief, conqueror and conquered, fell away, and what remained was something more basic, something human. But those moments could not last. The show had to go on. The crowds were waiting. The tickets had been sold. And so they returned to their roles, Cody to his elaborate introductions and dramatic gestures, Sitting Bull to his silent circuit of the arena. The season ended in October. Sitting Bull declined to return for the next year's tour. He had seen enough. He had earned enough or given away enough to help his people through another winter. It was time to go home. Cody tried to change his mind. He offered better terms, more money, greater comfort, but Sitting Bull was unmoved. His decision was final. They parted with gifts and promises to stay in touch. Cody gave Sitting Bull a gray horse that had been trained to perform tricks, to sit, to bow, to raise its hoof on command. It was a peculiar gift, a reminder of the show business world that Sitting Bull was leaving behind. But he accepted it graciously. perhaps sensing that Cody meant it as a genuine token of affection. Sitting Bull returned to Standing Rock. Cody continued to tour, his show growing ever larger and more elaborate. They would never see each other again. The years that followed were difficult for Sitting Bull. The reservation system grew more oppressive. Government agents worked to undermine his authority, to break the remaining bonds of traditional society. They pushed for individual land ownership, knowing that it would fragment tribal unity. They pushed for Christianity, knowing that it would erode traditional spiritual practices. They pushed for assimilation, knowing that it would erase indigenous identity altogether. Sitting Bull resisted. He spoke out at meetings. He encouraged his people to maintain their customs. He refused to bow to pressure, even when it came with threats of punishment. And then came the ghost dance. The movement spread rapidly in 1890, offering hope to peoples who had been stripped of almost everything. It promised restoration, the return of the buffalo, the resurrection of the ancestors, the disappearance of the white invaders. It was a dream of redemption, a vision of a world made right again. Sitting Bull did not condemn it. How could he? His people had lost everything. If they found comfort in these rituals, in these promises, who was he to take that away from them? But the government saw only danger. They saw gatherings of indigenous peoples. They heard reports of excitement and fervor. They imagined uprisings and attacks. Their fear outweighed their understanding. In early December, orders came to arrest Sitting Bull. He was to be removed from the reservation before he could cause trouble. The task was given to Indian police, Lakota men who had been recruited to enforce white law among their own people. They arrived at his cabin before dawn on December 15, 1890. They found him sleeping. They told him he was under arrest. He agreed to go peacefully, asking only for time to dress and saddle his horse. But word had spread. Supporters gathered outside the cabin, angry at this intrusion, protective of their leader. Tensions rose. Voices were raised. Someone reached for a weapon, and then it happened. Shots fired, bodies falling, chaos and confusion in the cold morning air. When the shooting stopped, Sitting Bull lay on the ground, struck by bullets from men who shared his blood, his language, his history. He was gone. The grey horse, the one Cody had given him, heard the gunfire and began to perform its tricks, sitting, raising its hoof, responding to the sounds it had been trained to recognize. Amid the tragedy, this small absurdity unfolded, a ghost of the show business world intruding upon the brutal reality of reservation life. Sitting Bull was buried quickly, without ceremony, in a corner of the military cemetery at Fort Yates. The government wanted him forgotten, his influence erased, his memory suppressed. But memory is not so easily controlled. Word of his death reached newspapers across the country. It reached Europe, where he had once been presented to royalty. It reached everyone who had ever seen him in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, who had booed or cheered or simply watched in fascination as he rode silently through the arena. And it reached William Cody. Cody was performing in another city when he heard the news. By most accounts, he was shaken. He had tried to prevent this. He had offered to go to Standing Rock himself, to use his relationship with Sitting Bull to bring him in without violence. Permission had been granted, then revoked at the last moment. Politics and bureaucracy had gotten in the way, and now his friend was gone. Cody never spoke publicly about his grief. He was a showman, always performing, never fully revealing what lay beneath the surface. But his actions suggested something deeper than mere professional loss. He arranged for Sitting Bull's family to receive support. He purchased the grey performing horse, bringing it back into his show as a living reminder of a partnership that should never have ended this way. He spoke of Sitting Bull in interviews with a respect that went beyond what audiences expected, and he continued performing year after year as if the show itself had become a memorial, a way of keeping alive a world that was already disappearing. The Wild West show endured until 1913, when financial difficulties finally forced its closure. By then, Cody was an old man, weakened by years of travel and performance, watching the frontier he had celebrated recede into myth. He died in 1917, surrounded by family, with almost nothing left of the fortune he had once accumulated. He had given it away, spent it, lost it to bad investments and worse partners. But his reputation remained intact. He was Buffalo Bill, the man who had shown the world what the Wild West looked like, or what he had imagined it looked like. They buried him on Lookout Mountain, overlooking Denver. The site became a tourist attraction, drawing visitors who wanted to see where the great showman rested. They came from across the country, across the world, to pay their respects to a man who had shaped how they understood American history. But what did they really understand? What had the show actually taught them? They learned that the West was a place of adventure and danger. They learned that brave men conquered harsh landscapes. They learned that civilization triumphed over savagery. They learned all the lessons that the show was designed to teach. They did not learn about the complexity behind the spectacle. They did not learn about the cultures that were destroyed, the peoples who were displaced, the violence that was obscured by theatrical reenactment. They did not learn about Sitting Bull's dignity, his generosity, his quiet resistance to forces he could not defeat. They learned a story, a compelling story, a commercially successful story, but not the whole story. That is always the danger with spectacle. It entertains, but it does not illuminate. It shows, but it does not explain. It gives us something to watch, but not necessarily something to understand. Sitting Bull knew this. He participated in the show, but he never fully embraced it. He took what it offered: money, visibility, the chance to be seen on his own terms, without surrendering his deeper truth. He walked through the white man's world without becoming part of it. He observed without being absorbed, and in the end he returned to his people and died among them, refusing to abandon his identity even when it cost him his life. There is a lesson in that refusal, a lesson about integrity, about resistance, about the courage required to remain yourself when everything around you is designed to make you someone else. Buffalo Bill sold stories. Sitting Bull lived one. Sitting Bull. Both men are remembered today, but in different ways. Cody is celebrated as an entertainer, a pioneer of popular culture, a man who gave the world what it wanted. Sitting Bull is honored as a leader, a visionary, a man who gave his people what they needed. Neither assessment is complete. Both men were more complicated than their legends suggest. Cody was not just a showman. He was also someone who genuinely respected indigenous cultures, even as he profited from simplifying them. Sitting Bull was not just a mystic. He was also a pragmatist who understood the value of visibility, even in compromised circumstances. Together they created something that neither could have achieved alone. For 4 months in 1885, they stood side by side. Former enemies turned unlikely partners, each using the other for purposes the audience could only guess at. It was exploitation and alliance. It was commerce and connection. It was a performance and something more, a glimpse of what might have been possible if history had unfolded differently. We cannot change the past. We cannot undo the violence and displacement that shaped the American West. We cannot bring back the buffalo or the ways of life that depended on them. We cannot resurrect Sitting Bull or give him the justice he deserved, but we can remember. We can look at the old photographs and see not just costumes and poses, but real people with real lives. We can read between the lines of the promotional materials and glimpse the complexity that the show was designed to hide. We can honor both men, the showman and the chief, for what they achieved and acknowledge what they failed to overcome. And we can carry their story forward, telling it to new generations who need to understand that history is never as simple as it seems, that heroes can be flawed, that villains can have dignity, that former enemies can find common ground, if only for a moment, if only on a stage. The Wild West is gone now. The frontier exists only in memory and myth. But the questions that Cody and Sitting Bull raised, about identity, about representation, about who gets to tell the story, remain as urgent as ever. Every time we consume media, we participate in spectacle. Every time we accept a simple narrative, we risk missing the complexity beneath. Every time we look at a photograph, a film, a performance, we face a choice, to take it at face value or to ask what lies behind it. Buffalo Bill understood the power of spectacle. Sitting Bull understood the power of presence. Together they remind us that truth is never fully captured by any single performance, any single story, any single point of view. The showman who sold his enemy's story, the chief who refused to be diminished by it. 2 men, 1 stage, and a partnership that still echoes across the centuries. This is their legacy, not the myths they created or the myths created about them, but the questions they force us to ask about ourselves, our history, and the stories we choose to believe. Remember them, not as legends, not as symbols, but as men who lived through extraordinary times and made choices that still resonate today. And remember, always, that history is not just something that happened to other people. It is the foundation on which we build our present, the lens through which we see our future. Choose your stories wisely. They shape who we become,